The world has seen dramatic policy shifts from the U.S. this year since President Trump entered office. Trump has now recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital, despite intense opposition from many world leaders. His bold move seems likely to bring more uncertainty to this chaotic region. The president has also retreated from globalization, withdrawn from many multilateral frameworks, including TPP, taking a tough stance on Iran's nuclear deal, and shown U.S. muscle to DPRK over its nuclear program. Amid all this, China is putting much effort into realizing its own national rejuvenation. How should we evaluate Trump's policy shifts this year? Will a rising China take on more leadership and responsibility as the U.S. retreats? And what should be China's top focus in 2018? To discuss the U.S. global strategy under Trump's administration and more, I'm happy to be joined today by former U.S. National Security Advisor, Senior Fellow in Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Mr. Jake Sullivan. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. The recent front page story about the United States, I'm afraid, is the decision by President Trump to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Of course, it's a very important move to please those Christian fundamentalists who would be an important part of his power base to support his presidency. A critical moment of Russian contacts, you know what I mean. So what do you think of the impact? Because a lot of world leaders show their strong opposition, particularly Arab leaders.
Well, I think this was a political decision, not a foreign policy decision. This was about Trump and his supporters. It was not about moving the peace process forward. It's hard to find a good argument for this decision with respect to advancing the cause of peace in the Middle East. And I do think that it's created turbulence and turmoil when we didn't need to do that. On the other hand, I don't believe that we were near to a peace agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians, so I'm not sure that it will have that significant an impact on the possibility of arriving at a two-state solution, because I think we're in a difficult moment right now where neither the leadership on the Israeli side nor the leadership on the Palestinian side seems prepared to make the compromises necessary for peace.
How important is the influence of some of the lobby groups, because you were talking about domestic politics?
I don't think that this decision was driven by any kind of outside advocacy group. I think that this was a decision taken by Trump and some of his closest supporters who believed that it would
including his son-in-law?
I think his son-in-law very much supported the decision, and which is interesting because, of course, Jared Kushner has taken on the responsibility for leading American efforts to try to produce a peace agreement between Israelis and Palestinians. So I was surprised that he would support a move like this, which can only set back that effort, set back that cause. But yes, his son-in-law supported it. And so I think this was a small circle of people who concluded that there would be political benefit to doing this, and they did it.
A lot of the observers of the Middle East were taken aback when President Trump said he would decertify the nuclear deal of 2015 concerning the nuclear capability and ambition of Iran. What do you think?
Well, I think that Donald Trump has been playing games with the Iranian nuclear deal. He's been raising questions about whether he's going to stay in or leave. And in doing that, he has created a situation in which the rest of the world is more worried about the risk Washington poses than they are about the risk Tehran poses. And that is not in America's strategic interest. So I think the best thing that Donald Trump could do is tell the world he is going to commit to the deal, that he is going to enforce the deal, and then he's going to ask the rest of the world to join him in holding Iran accountable for all of its other behavior. But that's not the course that he's taken so far. Instead, he has created an unstable situation, which I don't think is in America's interest, and I don't think it's in the interest of regional stability.
What's dangerous is that the Trump administration has decided to take sides in the sectarian violence. For example, his recent visit to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, ended up signing hefty contracts about arms sales. That would, of course, serve to show up the morale for Riyadh at a moment when, its domestic politics as well as diplomatic row with Qatar, to say nothing of the civil strife in Syria, which faces a post-war rebuilding, would only add to more of the uncertainty in this region?
Well, I think that question, the way that you frame the question, doesn't take into account fully the unique threat and the unique destabilizing role that Iran is posing right now. It's Iran's backing, along with Russia, of Bashar Assad that has led to the death of 700,000 Syrians and to a refugee flow of millions. It's Iran that has been involved in undermining governments in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Iraq, and has been involved in massive human suffering in Syria. So, from my perspective, I do think the United States should be talking to its friends and partners in the region about how we can hold Iran accountable. But I also believe that the only long-term solution in this region is if we de-escalate the tension on all sides and create a situation in which the major powers in the region can coexist. So I think we have to have a combined strategy of pushing back against Iran's behavior and working towards a long-term diplomatic solution.
In their review, historians would of course reassess the impact of the Arab Revolution, with Syria being one of the case studies. Now, you said Russia and Iran had been very supportive of the Assad regime, but don't you think the civil strife in Syria is actually a proxy war between Shiites and Sunnis, with Saudi Arabia on one side supporting the rebels? By the way, the rebels themselves include Kurds, even some of the dangerous Islamic extremists such as ISIL. In this camp, you have a diversified ragtags, and even the United States could not figure out clearly who is the real friends or allies. In this way, when you accuse Russia and Iran of supporting the Assad regime, don't you think military intervention itself with the Arab Revolution went wrong seriously, leading to disasters in this chaotic region?
Well, of course, the United States didn't intervene militarily in Syria, and Syria is the worst of all of the cases across the Middle East. So I don't think laying the challenges of the Middle East at the door of military intervention, American military intervention, is correct. Of course, our military intervention in places like Iraq were obviously destabilizing, and I was opposed to the course of action we took there. But to suggest that it's American policy in Syria or Saudi policy in Syria that is chiefly responsible for the chaos there, I think misses the crucial point that there has been indiscriminate slaughter of civilians. Not just the killing of terrorists, but the bombing of cities where women and children and orphans and old people are being killed by the hundreds of thousands. And I don't think saying that all of that is in the service of greater stability, which is what the Iranians and Russians and Assad try to say, holds up to scrutiny when you look at the way they've actually prosecuted this war.
But to pick a fight with the Russians in Syria, which happens to be the last stronghold of the Russian overseas military posts, might be one of the major issues for the Obama administration, which ironically prefer to lead from behind. What do you think of the anger of Riyadh after the Obama administration failed to honor its commitment? And do you think this defiance of Riyadh and the refusal of the Obama administration of having military intervention all fueled the sectarian violence? And what President Donald Trump did in Riyadh was to further inflame the region.
I don't think the United States having a security relationship with Saudi Arabia necessarily inflames the region. We're talking about this playing out over the course of many years, and pieces that are extraordinarily expensive, including, by the way, a missile defense system for Saudi Arabia that would allow it to protect itself against increasingly advanced Iranian missiles, some of which have been fired at Saudi Arabia by Iran-backed rebels in Yemen, the Houthis. But I think there's a larger issue here that your question raises, which is, was the red line in Syria, was the fact that the Obama administration did not take military action in Syria something that resulted in further chaos and catastrophe in the region? This is the difficulty of being a major power. The United States had to face a hard choice here. On the one hand, striking to enforce the red line was something I supported. I thought we should do that. And I think that the fact that we didn't do it did lead to further difficulties in Syria. However, President Obama had to deal with a very difficult question, which was, if I don't strike and I work out a deal, I can remove huge stores of chemical weapons from Syria that could otherwise fall into the hands of terrorists.
In fact, Moscow offered an alternative plan to shift chemical weapons elsewhere for the destruction of them under the supervision of the nuclear watchdog of the United Nations.
Right, and it was the United States and Russia working together that actually brought that result about, that got massive amounts of chemical weapons material out of Syria and out of harm's way with respect to falling into the hands of ISIS or Al-Qaeda or other terrorist groups. That's really important, and I think if you ask Israeli leaders or you ask other leaders in the region about the positive impact on security from that deal, they would say this is something very meaningful. So President Obama was faced with a difficult set of decisions and had to make trade-offs, and that's one of the responsibilities of being a significant power in the Middle East like the United States is.
Let's look at the flashpoint in Northeast Asia, the DPRK. Increasingly, media reports here in China say, look, the war would soon break out. Although counter-arguments could also say, not yet, because we fail to see any massive evacuation of American military personnel from South Korea, Japanese personnel from South Korea. Neither do we see any major move by Seoul, the South Korean authorities, to evacuate its civilians from the Seoul capital city, which can easily come under intensive artillery fire from the north. These signs indicate if we were to see such massive evacuation of personnel, it means war would immediately break out. But none of that happened. What do you think of, say, this issue of brinksmanship? Or do you think, look, Ray, this is something real?
I think this is something real. And I think it's very dangerous, because I think that the risks of conflict on the Korean Peninsula and the possible catastrophe that could result are enormous. But I believe that this administration has voices in it that are making the case that the United States should potentially exercise the military option against North Korea. And I don't think that you will necessarily see the evacuation of all of American personnel and civilians from South Korea before such action takes place. So I think that China and the rest of the region should be prepared for the possibility, not the certainty, maybe not even the likelihood, but the distinct possibility that the United States will use military action in North Korea.
Look, Jake, when you say there shouldn't be the necessary moves to evacuate the personnel, be they American, Japanese, or South Korean, from the capital city of Seoul, are you assuming that in the first 5 or 10 minutes of the war, the American Air Force, along with their allies in Northeast Asia, would be able to comprehensively and completely destroy all of the artillery of the DPRK? Are you saying or suggesting that your Air Force and missiles would be capable of destroying all of the nuclear facilities in the first 5 or 10 minutes? Otherwise, it means heavy casualties of millions of people in the first day or second day of the war.
Just to be absolutely clear, as I said in my previous answer, I believe that the risks of military action are enormous and the possibility for catastrophe is real. And I didn't say that we shouldn't evacuate people. I didn't say that. What I said was that the Trump administration might not. As a matter of prediction, it's possible that they could take military action without doing that.
But on condition that no casualties would be inflicted on American military personnel in South Korea or Guam, which could be easily targeted by the North Korean missiles, right?
I think you've raised the very significant human costs that could unfold here, both on the peninsula and in other parts of the region. The only point I'm making is that I don't think China, in watching the possibility of American military action, Chinese leaders should say, well, there's only one possibility, which is they would only do it after taking a whole bunch of preparatory moves. I'm not sure that that's necessarily the case from the Trump administration's perspective. My own perspective is that we should do everything in our power to avoid the possibility of war here, because I believe that war is a terrible option for the United States at this point in North Korea.
Don't you think these military maneuvers are just kind of preventive diplomacy, brinksmanship, bluffs instead of a real? Politicians talk smart about the use of force, yet the military would say there's no winner for any war. So eventually we are ready to accept a nuclear-armed DPRK. Do you think this will unfortunately be a brutal fact in the foreseeable future, and the international society will do nothing?
You know, I think that there are many observers here in Beijing, including in the government, who look at what the United States is doing right now and think this is all game playing. It's all brinksmanship. It's all bluff. I think that's dangerous. And because I believe that the possibility of American military action in North Korea is very real and much more serious than that. And with all the potential negative consequences that flow from it. But I believe that the leaders in Beijing and the leaders in Pyongyang should proceed from the assumption that the Trump administration is considering this as a real possibility, and this is not just theater. This is not just suggesting the military option as a means of trying to pursue coercive diplomacy. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to happen. It doesn't even necessarily mean it's likely to happen. But the conversation about military action in the corridors of power in Washington is different today than I've seen it at any point in the last 20 years.
Yeah, if you look at history, most of the devastating wars broke out due to miscalculations and the inability to manage disputes and crises.
Which could easily happen here.
You are watching Dialogue with Mr. Jake Sullivan, former National Security Advisor to Joseph Biden, Vice President of the Obama administration, currently Senior Fellow with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We shall be back in a short while. Stay with us, please. Welcome back. Do you think that the Trump administration has a clear strategy on Asia, compared with the Back to Asia, which was indeed very clear to focus on the alleged China threat and to rebalance the alleged assertiveness of the People's Republic of China?
Well, first of all, I don't agree that the pivot or rebalance was about the China threat or targeted to the China threat. I believe the pivot and rebalance was about trying to create a regional order with China and every other major country in this region, as well as ASEAN, the Southeast Asian countries, that worked for everyone, that worked for China, that worked for the United States, and that worked for all of the other players in the region. An economic, security, and political order that could produce stability, prosperity, and security. So this was not about containing China or going at China, although I think there were some misunderstandings as it was rolled out. I think the Trump administration so far in the first year, their Asia policy has basically been a North Korea policy. North Korea has been such a dominant issue that I think it has distracted them from thinking more broadly about the entire region. Now, on President Trump's most recent trip, he laid out this concept of the Indo-Pacific strategy. But I don't think that they've yet given content to that or described what exactly it is that they intend to pursue in that regard. So, you know, we'll have to wait and see whether, in fact, they come up with a more comprehensive, clear regional strategy. But right now, it seems to be mostly about dealing with the North Korea threat.
You know, Jake, your description of the Trump strategy on Asia sounds a little bit far-fetched. For most of the observers in China, they would say this is none other than just a policy option. It's been an act of reaction instead of a proactive maneuver to craft a vision and a blueprint about how to deal with a rising power such as the PRC. Instead, your attention has been diverted and derailed by the uncertainty of a regime in Pyongyang. So eventually, with the hindsight wisdom arising from the Obama administration, with which you had been deeply involved in policy planning for the State Department, what do you think should be a sound and reasonable strategy on Asia?
Well, I think what has to happen is all of the significant actors in this region need to find a way to have a serious conversation about how we update the rules of the region, the regional order, the rules-based order in this region, so that they reflect current realities but protect some basic facts. Number one, that we have an open, fair, transparent economic system in Asia where everybody plays by the rules. What's it going to take to get from here to there? Number two, where no country tries to intimidate or coerce another country through military force, but rather plays by the rules of the maritime domain, the land domain, the sea domain, cyber domain, etc. What's it going to take to get from here to there? And third, where we can all find a way to work together, to mobilize action together to deal with a set of collective threats, whether it's climate change or nuclear proliferation or disease or humanitarian disaster, that no one country can solve on its own, that all countries have to come together to solve in concert. That is what we have to do as a strategy, and that requires not one country dictating terms to everyone else, but all of the countries coming together and saying, what's it going to take? How are we going to pull this off? And I think the United States has a crucial role to play in that, and I think China has a crucial role to play in that, but this is not just up to the United States and China. There are many other important voices that need to be heard as well as we move towards a more sustainable future in the
Jake, I got a strong feeling your analysis seems to be based on the assumption that someone who is rising very quickly will challenge the existing rules of the game. Well, China might be one of the challenges from the perspectives of some of the American policymakers. However, China emphasizes over and over that we are the beneficiary of the existing world economic order. We have benefited enormously from maritime commerce, trade, whatever you call it. So there's no reason whatsoever for China to challenge the existing order, except that the order itself should be more inclusive, right? Should take China seriously, India seriously, and other emerging markets more seriously. Lawmakers in Senate, for example, have been pretty reluctant. That somehow reflects the mindset of someone who designed the old world order and someone who would be extremely unwilling to accept any challenges. But this world is in the 21st century. This is a pretty brand new world order. It needs to be improved. Do you agree?
I agree it needs to be improved.
Mm-hmm.
I agree that we need new rules to deal with new threats. I agree that we need to adjust our institutions so that we bring in new voices that have an increasing stake in how problems get solved. But I also believe that we cannot forget the things that work, and we need to defend and protect the things that work. And you made the point in your question that China has been a beneficiary of the order, and I think that's absolutely correct. I think the United States has played a crucial role in creating the conditions where the Chinese people and the Chinese country was able to unleash its potential and grow dramatically over the course of the past many decades.
These days, even a few years back during the Obama administration, Republicans and Democrats started to say, let's reassess our policy of engagement. Because and moves taken by the Obama administration and which might be continuously be taken by the new administration include anti-dumping, anti-subsidy investigations. This is none other than the issue of trade protectionism. That will be suicidal. That will be counterproductive. When you say you want to engage China, China says, yes, let's do it. Let's move ahead. But then China still denied the market economic status. Right? We face the anti-dumping, anti-subsidy investigations using the surrogate country approach to judge our dumping practices. So a lot of these things point to the fact that we face increasing pressure of trade protectionism by someone who rejects globalization. Don't forget the trade war between Japan and the United States in the 1980s about the you're urging Japanese authorities to import more of your luxury cars and automobiles. The Japanese government rejected the opening up of its automobile market, hence the trade war. Of course, the Japanese yielded to your pressure eventually, but you punished Japan with the Plaza Accord, leading to almost 2 decades of stagnation of the Japanese economy. So this is what we saw. This is what we experienced. Could be a bitter lesson Chinese keep in mind. That's why we talk about trade war and trade protectionism.
I think it's a challenge if China sees every enforcement action the United States takes as the opening shot in a trade war. I think instead a more reasonable approach is to look at the case the United States is making and say, do they have a point? And I think with some of these dumping issues, the United States has put forward a very strong case. But we should be able to put this in a broader perspective. We cannot just make it about single issues, steel or aluminum or solar panels. We have to think more generally about how we create an economic relationship between the United States and China that can work for both our countries. And having an economic dialogue that takes on the larger questions about the nature of the Chinese economy and the nature of the rules that we're dealing with, because the WTO doesn't address many of these new challenges to free and fair trade. And we've got to take those on, and we've got to work on them. And I think we can do that in a mature way without getting into a trade war and without having one country simply threaten or bully the other, but rather sit down as adults, as the two largest economies in the world, and figure this out. But I think in this regard, Democrats and Republicans, President Trump, like President Obama and others, have a strong view that they have to look out for the interest of American workers and do so in an enlightened and effective way, and I think they're right to do that.
Dialogue instead of confrontation should be the most viable option on the table. However, when you look at Xi Jinping, who is said to be the strongest man since Mao Zedong, went to Florida hat in hand to have the first summit with your president. He invited President Trump to Gugong, the Forbidden City, to take a look at the cultural relics, to show our warm hospitality, to have a constructive dialogue. And yet, the latest decision by President Trump to suspend the comprehensive economic dialogue, do you think this is a part of the package about the DPRK nuclear issue? He's been using Taiwan, the DPRK, whatever, as a package. He's a businessman. His transactional way of thinking might prevent the real professional team like you from assisting with him and giving him a clear picture. Very quickly, what do you think of?
You know, it's interesting to hear you give that assessment of the first year of President Trump, because I believe that the Chinese leadership today, including President Xi Jinping, thinks, in fact, things are much better than we would have expected they might be, given what Donald Trump said on the campaign trail. In fact, the United States has not so far done many of the things President Trump raised as possible actions against China.
Because he used the tweets instead of formal policy options.
Well, I actually believe that this administration should take a very serious look at what the next step should be in the U.S.-China relationship and make sure that we are working to deal with some of the concerns that the United States has on these issues. And in that context, China should raise the issues it has as well. But I don't believe that sitting here today, somehow the United States has been unfair to China over the course of the last year. If anything, President Trump has been quite soft in the way that he's approached the economic relationship with China. That may change next year. And I think figuring out a way to make sure that the interaction of our leaders on the issue on these economic issues is a positive one, is one that is constructive and gets to a good outcome. That's what we all have to focus on.
Thank you so much. In fact, public opinions at home and abroad are quite diversified with regard to whether the presidency of Donald Trump is a curse or a blessing for U.S.-China relationship. We're going to wait to see what will happen tomorrow or next year. Thank you so much, and Merry Christmas.
Thanks for having me. Merry Christmas.